over to Bear. And yeah, Dale, just really looking forward to having a fun conversation with you about one of our favorite illumined ones that we seem to bring up on every Alpha cast. So
I hope you don't mind. I took a little creative license, but I do consider you the voice of Rudolph Steiner. So in the write-up, I included that description. So I hope you don't take exception with it.
I don't. It's
But
become
to
what
me,
it
you
is.
are the voice. Yeah.
It appears so.
yeah, and
Thank
don't
you.
And I love your readings. They're wonderful.
Mike,
yeah,
have you been to Denver, Mike? Because you look really familiar to me. You've never been to Denver.
Denver. I mean, I've been there snowboarding a bunch.
Okay, but never down in the city. Okay.
You might have seen his face on the post office wall once or twice.
Yeah,
Brings
that
to
was
mind a
when
Bob Dylan stanza.
that was when my beard was darker. The salt and peppers helped me hide out here up in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. No, Dale, so excited to have you on today. And no offense, take no offense to this, but many a night I've fallen asleep to your voice. Now that's not because your voice is boring or anything. It's just that I love falling asleep to Rudolph Steiner. It's like, and then my dreams are really trippy.
All right.
But no,
and you do have a wonderful voice. Perfect.
Yeah,
for the
it's such
job.
such a comforting voice, and of course, those lectures are just so deep. It's rich material, and I can't wait to get into it today. So I'm going to hit record and fire this up. Oh, we sound good, guys. Everyone in the chat, excited to see everybody in there today. Pamela Swam, Dougie, good to see you. All the Didge, thank you for being here. We love you guys, and thanks for all the support, especially all our admins in there. Okay, here we go. I'm going to hit record. Let's do it. And boom, we're back for another episode of AlphaCast. I'm Mike Winter, and I'm here as always with the maestro of the Alfa Vedic Symphony, Dr. Bear Paul Lando, coming to you live and direct from the great state of Jefferson, where freedom still reigns supreme up here on the beautiful azure waters of the Smith River, which is flowing nicely with all the rain we got in December. But it has been a dry January. I'm not talking alcohol. I'm talking not a raindrop, as they've dusted us out. New fires popping up left and right down in SoCal. Our heart goes out to all you guys, and especially all those firefighters and first responders. As Bear and I have both been that in our past. We really respect you guys. Bear, there was like one that popped up off the 405 last night. They got that out quickly. 2 in San Diego. They got those out quickly. Something's going on here, guys. It seems pretty obvious, and just stay vigilant down there. We've got a lot of community
As a
members.
California native for more years than I care to admit, I've never seen anything like this, and they keep telling us it's a new normal. I'd like one of the experts tell us why normal is now not normal. So, Mike, go ahead, take it away.
I can't think of a better guest today to dive into normal being not normal and not normal being normal. So we're going to go deep into Rudolph Steiner today with the voice of Rudolph Steiner from the Steiner Press YouTube channel that we all know so well. Dale Brunsvold's with us today. It seems that we mention Rudolph Steiner almost on every show. His reach is broad, has had a massive impact on our lives and on our business here and everything that we do on the farm, especially in with Bear's Medicine, with how we teach our kids. It's just it's amazing what this man brought to the world, and then how that can be applied to today, which is extremely important. The evolution of consciousness is the raison d'etre. Did I say that right? How do you say that, Bear? You're really testing me today.
You're gonna make me pull out my 10 years of French in Catholic school that I failed in miserably. Just go on. You probably did a better job than me.
Okay. For mankind's arduous journey through the Maya of physicality, just as the overseers have imbued this realm with the precise attributes to incubate developing humanity, great luminaries embody at pivotal times to fan the flames of awareness. The another one, ineradicable. Ineradicable. Wow. Imprint left on the ethers by the Nazarene forged a path for future luminaries who would stay the course for the larger body of man. Secret societies were necessary in the darkest of times to safeguard sacred truths that could only be made available when enough of humanity approached the reintegration of spirit and matter. The Rosicrucians were one such order, whose lineage included the Compte de St. Germain, that laid the foundations for the Theosphical Society and the eventual Anthroposophical teachings of Rudolph Steiner. Steiner's Anthroposophic movement broke the seal of secrecy as he admonished Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists that man was once again prepared to embrace his prime directive. Steiner anthroposophy has enjoyed a resurgence of interest in recent decades, and many are now familiar with the Rudolph Steiner Press audio series. Each episode, Resentment, is a select reading from the eclectic and immense body of Steiner's work, brilliantly articulated from what has now become the voice of Rudolph Steiner. On this AlphaCast, Dale Brunsvold, the voice, joins us for an in-depth discussion on the insights and prophetic writings of Steiner, his many contributions to medicine and agriculture as well. Dale developed a personal interest in Steiner after years of listening to many recordings, and in February of 2005 was granted permission from the Rudolph Steiner Press in England to record and post the lectures online. We know that many Steiner students within the Alfa Vedic community will eagerly anticipate this episode, and you're here in the chat. We bless you and thank you for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this chat. Lando, take it away, my friend.
Dale, so delightful to have you here with us today. And I've spent many hours listening to your voice, and it has become synonymous with Rudolph Steiner. And so this is going to be great fun today. When I wrote that little intro that Mike just read there, my timeline is based on about 40 years of very intimate involvement with the original St. Germain Press folks. And so behind the scenes there's a lot of information as far as how the Theosophical, Rosicrucian to Theosophical to Anthroposophical, and Steiner kind of taking the lids of secrecy off. So I'll be interested to see if that matches, your timeline as well. And just so you understand a little bit why we are students of Rudolf Steiner, is I first became involved in medicine with studies in anthroposophical medicine, and I really incorporated a lot of those principles into my practice over the years. And then that was beginning in the 70s, and then in the early 80s, we had our first off-grid homestead in Hawaii, and I became very interested in this biodynamic farming. We started to have kids in the later 70s, so we decided to homeschool them, and a lot of the Steiner Waldorf method, we incorporated into our homeschooling as well. And in the early 80s, a family of mine that became clients of mine, we'll say patients, the gentleman in the family was considered the premier Rudolf Steiner expert in the world at that time. He's from Germany. He was a very well-known classical composer and conductor. And he had a sound room in the Hawaiian Islands that he took me into and kind of lit me up with his understanding, of Steiner and his approach to music and how it involved the astral body and what was really going on in music, when we hear through the ear canal. So that got me more involved in the esoteric part, I'd say, of Steiner, beyond just medicine and farming. So this is going to be great. I would think that there's probably nobody now as well versed as you are in all of the lectures, given by Steiner. So this is going to be great fun. So maybe we could start off by you just outlining maybe how you got involved in this, and was it divine providence or obviously it wasn't by chance, I don't think. So just your involvement all these years, and what you take away from the maybe the Steiner teachings relative to how they might be applicable to life on our planet today. So thank you again for being here, and we'll just let you give a little short history here, my friend.
Thank you. Is my name say Lily Kellogg on the bottom there? Is that what everybody's seeing? Just in case, that's my wife. I'm using her
Oh,
computer in case that's a confusion for anybody.
okay.
From
I
the
only have one
So I
name.
won't call you Lily.
from the Serial Empire.
That's right. No. But, yeah. So,
Unfortunately, right?
well, yeah, I guess so, maybe.
Yes and no.
So, I I was in a class in college in a graduate course in Wittgenstein, who I never really understood in the end anyway. And a guy named Hank Passifero. I don't know if you ever heard of him. Elia Rael. He changed his name to Elia Rael. And he was asking strange questions, using words like percept and concept. And his frame of reference was just something I had never heard of before. And I asked him about it. And he just looked at me and he slid the Michael Wilson translation of The Philosophy of Freedom, that little white book with the red lettering, if you remember that, across the table. And I looked down and I saw this name, Rudolph Steiner. And I thought it was comical at first. It sounded like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer to me or something. And but then all of a sudden, not touching the book or anything, I really did. I got a singular joy in the depths of my heart. I didn't know why. Why am I so happy? What is going on? So I do think something happened there that was either a past life or, really providence of some kind. And I took to it right away. I was philosophy major and absolutely studied, interested in epistemology. How do we know? What is the nature of knowing? I've never been much of a believer, so I want to know rather than believe. But I imagine I've got some residual beliefs somewhere deep in myself. But so anyway, I just took off. I studied that for a while. Then he showed me an outline of esoteric science or occult science. I couldn't believe it was the same guy in a way. And then my whole world just opened up. It's like I say to people, he gave me back the other half of the world that our materialistic orientation has just erased, and it had to, as we know from the evolution of consciousness. There was a need for us to, become egos on the physical plane as honestly as we could, which meant no overshadowing by the higher worlds for a while. And yeah, so that was momentous. But I didn't really notice that momentousness until years later. It just sort of gradually congealed into an awareness. I was going through, the troubles of life, and adolescence seemed to last longer than it should have. So that kind of thing. But yeah, so I just started recording him in 1978, as I mentioned before, just for cassettes, just to have in the car or on my Walkman when I was taking walks. I didn't have a car, so I'd go to school walking and stuff. And then I had those, all the basic books, and then gradually, you got MP3s and you could put a whole book on one CD on a Walkman. If you remember those days, most of you listening don't, I'm pretty sure. And that was extraordinary. In fact, having a whole bunch of books on one CD was amazing. And you could walk around with that, I felt.
At
And
that time, I thought Sony Walkmans were the end all of technology, and we'd
that's it. It
reached
was
our
over.
apex
Yeah,
at
we
that
had
moment.
finally completed it all. So then when the internet started to pop up into existence, right? This is before any of that had anything except for modems and that type of thing. One day it just dawned on me to see about maybe putting this stuff up on the web. And I actually, first I'll say this, I contacted Steiner Books in America, a man named Gene Goligly, who's passed away now. And his secretary's name was Mary Giddens, and she may still be there. That was November of 2004, and in February of 2005, she wrote back, said, "Yeah, Gene says it's fine. You can do that." But the guy from Rudolph Steiner Press, Savak, he held off. They were doing their own books. Peter Bridgemont, Sprachgestaltung guy from England, was doing books, but they didn't. I guess giving stuff away was kind of unfair, but I just wanted Steiner out in the world. I saw the world burning then, so to speak. Yeah. So I was just hoping for something I don't want a government that runs things. I don't want an outer structure coming at us and fixing us. My hope is something awakens in the center of everyone's heart and they just nod and go, yeah, this is how we should be living. Okay, that's that part of me that's still flaky, but I'm hoping still. The hope is still there.
Dale, you just nailed our entire motto here, inside out, self-governance, baby.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, self-governments. Yeah. And Steiner called it what? Ethical individualism, right? The whole idea that it would be anarchy. He goes, well, right, if you really have that as a truly cultivated inner life, you'll find your actions, as creative as they may be, will be in harmony with other people. Because the harmony we're all living in all the time anyway is not the differentiated world of perceptions, it's the common world of thinking. That's what brings us all actually into the same place. Because every perception you have, every perception I have is absolutely individualized to my place in space and time. And this is again, philosophy of freedom, which just stunned me why that isn't taught in a philosophy school. I mean, yeah, anyway, I think I got to rambling there. Anyway, so
Keep
after,
Dale, you're allowed to ramble here because that's where the meat is. That's the good stuff.
so I started in 2005. I put that up. It's still the same primitive site. I'll mention the original site is rudolphsteineraudio.com. And that still has everything on it. It's fairly searchable, but it doesn't stream. You just download your MP3s off of it, and your phone will do that and stuff. But I have everything on there. And then somebody asked me to do something on a streaming platform, so I went to Podbean. So rudolphsteiner.podbean.com then is the one that I started. Ironically, I did not start Rudolph Steiner Press Audio. That was started by a person in Hungary, and then there was some kerfuffles that happened, and Savak took it over in a sort of joint venture that, in a sense, I'm not part of at all. They just take the work and put it up on there. So, and it ended up being the stream everybody likes the best. I thought in those days, in 2005, I'm like, YouTube, well, it's just audio. There's no reason to put it up on there. I didn't know anything about anything, right? And now, so anyway, yeah. So that's how that worked. And
Well,
people
it's quite
still
a.
do that. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's quite a journey getting into the studies of Rudolph because it takes a while to digest what he's actually saying. But the more you get into it, what he's telling you is why there is an initial, just kind of an impediment for us glocking everything he's saying, because the understanding really comes on other levels. And so that is, I think, what students finally come to the realization. It's not just an intellectual lecture or thing that you have to wrap your mind around. There's a lot more going on there. So maybe anything you could add to that?
Sure. I mean, well, can I add to that? I'm not sure I can add, but yeah, when do we have an inclination to question existence at all, right? Isn't it fascinating that we're not placed into the world without questions? We're placed into the world with questions. So there's some part of our nature which on one side is too bad that it's incomplete, and on the other side is literally our freedom, our growth, our evolution, is that we're incomplete. We're constantly wanting to know why everything is what it is. Now, I don't know how real that is anymore in the younger generations. I do worry about that. Are they trying to find enough distractions that they simply shut down what I think is essential in the human being, and that is asking why, seeking out, something beyond what our physical sense perceptions provide, as it were. And I don't know. And I hoped also that the audio would do that too, in case people weren't reading anymore. And I get the feeling that that's true, that the people listen more now than they read. I still read quite a bit, so in an older generation, right? But so yeah, that didn't get to where you wanted to go to, but that's as far as they can go at the moment.
No, no. Well, the younger generation, while we're on that, it's more about data downloads than
Okay.
actually, digesting and making information experience in there for knowledge. And that would also be a good segue into Rudolf Steiner, I think, was one of the first ones that somewhat predicted the advent of AI, that we're really making a big deal out of it now. And we could talk about Luciferian and Armanian kind of influences and how, one-sided wanted all the data. And I believe you've read some lectures on that. Is that true?
Well, I don't remember him directly referencing AI,
Mhm.
but he does talk about technology, right, as we all know, and that there will be kind of a merging with humanity,
Mhm.
and it needs to be done consciously, like everything else does. Otherwise, you get Well, what do we have, right? I mean, I guess everybody, I don't know where to go with you guys because you know a lot, and I don't know, and the people that are listening in probably as well. But, we have these two forces in us that are part of our evolution now. We could call them hindering forces, right? The Ahrimanic forces have to do with our intelligence, and we need
Mhm.
that. We need the clarity of that intelligence, the logic, the objectivity of it. But then we have the Luciferic forces, which actually wrested us out of what was paradise, right? What was a union with nature, and brought us to the questioning that we're doing now, you could say. I think you could say that. So we got freedom from a hindering, horrible force in terms of some religions in the world, right? Which, of course, made Steiner hard to bear for a lot of people, right? So everybody's worried about them in a certain way because are the incarnation of Ahriman. Oh no, well, not oh no, right? That I don't know what that fear is from. I don't know why people are afraid of something that let's say if we're giving Steiner a benefit of the doubt, is saying is just part of the ongoing evolution of consciousness. That this is it's going to happen. It kind of needs to happen. Maybe I don't know if that's overstating it. And in all this, the the guiding force, the center that we're trying to stay connected to is the mystery of Golgotha, is the forces that Christ brought in the incarnational process, right? Not a belief system, though that can accelerate a lot of that experiencing of the Christ. It's not to be dismissed, but I don't know. In the end, it's a knowing, I think. I want to say that. I don't have that yet, but that's what I strive for. And so in that Christ, then Steiner says you really will take hold of the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic and turn them, in a sense, redeem them into the pathway of world evolution that the good gods intended. And that's a complicated story, isn't it? I mean, there's no way to simply state that and say, there, now we all know that now, let's move on. Right? So we're in that wrestling, right? And right now, as you say, as we say in America, especially, I've always considered America to kind of be the kingdom of Ahriman more than anything else. It's so intense with, behaviorist psychology where the self doesn't exist at all. It's a secondary phenomenon of behavior that, and all this, that our technology, as you're saying, we just want to grab onto it and integrate to it too fast. I feel, but that's maybe an old guy talking too. I don't know what that rhythm should be. And you guys should share on that, of course. But yeah, so we're in the midst of that, the grip of that right now. How are we going to have? I was talking to the priest, Raphael Novak is our wonderful priest here now in Denver at the Christian community. And, he was talking about how much social media forms the soul life of growing children. Well, I just don't have a picture of that. You guys have kids, maybe Mike, you have some kids or something. I have no clue. That doesn't, I'm like, what? So that kind of does alarm me, I got to say, if it's not monitored or held in the parents or how that all, I don't have any kids. So that whole family thing, I don't, have that at all anyway. So I wouldn't be able to share on that, but okay, I'm done with that now.
No, that's perfect. And by the way, we have no set curriculum here, and more than anything, we just want to hear from you because again, your experience with just really digesting all the lectures, and that's more what we want to hear from. As a parent and now a grandparent myself, the reason long ago in the 70s why we elected to homeschool our kids and adapt some Steiner principles in our curriculum is because we saw back then exactly what's really coming to a head now. What you're saying is, how does the present educational system really feed the soul or help evolve the soul of kids these days? I'm just not seeing it, but
Yeah, I was an educator for 37 years. I taught, that's what my job was, you might say.
Mhm.
But yeah, you saw what happened. What do you do when you don't have a pic? If you have a picture of the human being, everyone has a picture of the human being, and out of that picture of a human being, you're going to create your educational system. So if
Mhm.
we're just physical objects, either machine-like, which a lot of people turn to, or sacks of chemicals and behaviors that oh, how do we educate that? Well, that's a sad picture even to begin the process, isn't it? So
Yeah, not to mention then they add on all the other Prussian schooling systems,
yeah,
in terms of creating the worker bee and having everybody learn deference to officialdom and authority, all that. We homeschooled our children for a while here in the wilderness, but they wanted to go back to school mainly because they wanted to have friends and stuff. So they're going to a 150-year-old Catholic school that is scholastic minded, no cell phones, no phones allowed during the day, a lot of freedom, but a lot of discipline and old school, very old school. And so yeah, we felt like it was a good compromise. But the true schooling is it happens in the house with my kids will bring home their science quiz they got to study for, and we're kind of laughing at stuff, because I'm teaching them what I'm finding out about the false paradigms of atomism and even things around gravity, and like they never mention levity, right?
right, right.
And all of these things. So yeah, it really comes down to the parents. I will say one thing though, which is pretty cool about the culture of today and everything, and this is could segue nicely, and well, just continuing the conversation of the polarity, the trinity, if you will, of the Aramonic versus the Luciferian, and that center Christ balancing fulcrum, right? Is that maybe it's just due as a offshoot of just the connectivity of the internet and people just being more awake and aware, and also there is a bit of a woke culture around sensitivity around children, but they do not, like when I was a kid, you had the classic bully. You had school was kind of hell. You could get beat up really easily. It was tough, and I will say there's a sensitivity in the world now around that, and nerds and jocks and like all of the different stratifications that used to be in school are disappearing. And it's okay for a jock to wear a pink bunny suit to school. I know that could sound really lame, but like the point of it is that there's an openness that I never had as a kid. Like you'd be called terrible names if you decide to wear, like for instance, the best basketball players on my son's team wear pink Nike shoes. Now, maybe some people listening might be their
I don't know.
hackles
I
might,
draw the line there,
yeah, I was just
Mike.
gonna say their hackles raise at that, but my only point, my point about that is that there's always this seesawing back and forth, right, between the polarities. But I do feel like there's a compassion and a sensitivity that is very Christ-like in the culture, and that has gone a little maybe Luciferian in the last 10 years with the power structures at play, Dale, that push transgenderism and push transhumanism, and which transhumanism, I guess, could be more Aramonic, right? But in the new age, that's kind of gotten out of the way. But I will say there's a lot of positivity that I've seen out of this. And I'm just curious um, where you see sort of all of this heading in the vein of Steiner in relation to the general trends of the science and where science is going, and do you have fears around this stuff like AI, transhumanism, and all that, or do you see what we call like the great awakening happening where people are embracing Steiner, embracing the Christ energy to try to bring that harmony and balance to the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's that last part really rings for me. There's a man named Bastian Bahn who was a really great Christian community priest, and if I can remember how he says, we want to talk about the positive as much as possible, and we want to talk about the negative as much as necessary. I really like that.
Well put.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I really do like that. And I find that we are, and especially, and I'm in a lot of Facebook study groups. That's what I use Facebook for, is just anthroposophical study groups. And I do find a lot of people want to, and I'm not saying you're doing this, Mike, but people want to uh, stay with the negative and just mull it over and brood on it. And I'm like, for me, there might have been a time in my life when that was true, honestly, but not now. And it's like all we have is that hope. All we have is that spark of the spirit in us that just needs a, a better flint, to a flame, to become flamed up in a healthy way. And that's what I work on. I don't, as far as the complexities of the negativity, we can survey that to death, right? And it's there. But all these positive things you mentioned are excellent, and I love what you said, and that's what I try to do. And that was a big motivation, right? As I mentioned before, get the Steiner out there. I don't want people to believe in anything. I want them to ponder. I want their perspectives to become more complex, not to black and white everything, and then reach in and then hopefully work on themselves inwardly and not just assume, that strange conceit we have in our time is they can study evolution, they can see all the dinosaurs and the bones and the layers of the earth, and they get all that, and they're very comfortable with all this transformation of the earth, which is a quite extraordinary story. And then you mention, well, consciousness too must have done some evolving, right? And they go, what? That's nuts. Consciousness has always been exactly the same now as it was then. They were just stupid, and now we're smart, and that's a tough one to break through on. Because if you do break through on that, and you mentioned it so wonderfully in the introduction, the evolution of consciousness may be the fundamental concept of our age to somehow break into people's minds, because then history changes. Then all religions are correct, given that in their time, the modality of consciousness, the modality of cognition saw and understood the world a certain way that unfolded a religion authentically every single time. So none of them are wrong. But we have this, well, we separate them and all that. And that's, of course, always has caused such horrible problems. And science becoming a religion is also causing that separation of everything as well. So I
And
hope, that really that evolution
no,
of
no,
consciousness
go ahead.
is fundamental to me. Go ahead.
I was just going to say religions, of course, have contributed to the divisiveness. And, if you mention Luciferian, that, of course, triggers a lot of folks just with what we, connote with the figure of Lucifer. In the Saint Germain teachings, they talk about the Luciferian, principles that are basically, held in a memory bank by the Eastern Hemisphere of the planet. And those were really, seeking out of body experiences and so forth. And then Saint Germain knew that the New World, being more the Armanian influence, just the ability to ground in and manifest was equally as important. And he pointed to some of the chaos in the eastern part of the world, and that they were commonplace going into out of body experiences, but couldn't manifest anything on the ground. And then, in the Western world, kind of the opposite. So they described it as time for the two hemispheres to come together and create a balance, which I think is what Mike mentioned, with the Christ consciousness. But I think we really need to get over this more juvenile knee-jerk reaction whenever you hear a term like Luciferian and so forth. And also they, in those same circles, in the Saint Germain Foundation, they talk about the Theosophical Society and the fact that Madame Blavatsky was a very key figure at that time. And then, Rudolph Steiner, just felt, kind of at odds with the madam there, that, it was really time for people to embrace the truth, whereas the Theosophical, felt like, no, the world wasn't ready for it. And then the Saint Germain teachings came out on the heels of Rudolf Steiner and just saying, no, the truth not only has to be out, but it has to be presented in a way where even a child can understand it. So I don't know if any of that rings true to you as far as, your understanding with the whole Rudolf Steiner lineage.
What now? The image, everything? Sure. Yeah.
So do
I
you
mean,
think Rudolf Steiner's role was kind of, just exposing to the world, both sides of the coin? It was time for a reintegration of consciousness, spirit with matter, as we said.
And to pintail on that, was he sort of the Rosicrucian? Was he a Rosicrucian in your mind, and was he sort of deemed to be the one to bring a lot of the Rosicrucian teachings to the world, to outside of the occult nature of it, and more exoteric, if you will?
Yeah, I love this particular subject, but I'm going to hopefully not sound too sycophantic, right? So we're all sharing these ideas according to kind of how we carry them. I mean, I don't know that I know what I'm going to
Mm.
say, but it's going to sound like I know. I
Yeah,
don't want to mistake that for anything.
join the club.
Yeah, there we
Yeah.
go. But yeah, and there's a great set of lectures by Steiner of 1915. They're called The Occult Movement in the 19th Century. Have you ever heard
Ah,
of them?
great.
And in them, he
Yeah.
talks about materialism, what we would now call the technological side of it, maybe gives us a more stronger picture of it. But that in the 1800s, materialism, the initiates of that time, the brotherhoods, maybe the white brotherhoods of that time, could see that this was going to become very dangerous because the whole orientation of cognition, the consciousness soul era of cognition, us really getting involved in the physicality of the world, was such that we could get lost in that. And so the occult brotherhoods saw that there needed to be some infusion of spirituality in some way. It needed to occur. And they found the person to do this in H.P. Blavatsky, who was
Hmm.
this
Right.
extraordinary trance inducing, person who went into an unconscious state, but at the same time, apparently, from past lives and that type of thing, must have had the ability to penetrate so wonderfully as she did. However unbalanced it was, Steiner then says later on, right? And of course, it grew like crazy. It was created in New York City in 1875. I don't know if you guys
Hmm.
know that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
and it was huge.
Colonel, who's the gentleman that worked with her again?
Alcott, was it? Was it
Y-
Alcott?
Yeah, Alcott. Yeah.
Yeah, Colonel Alcott. Yeah. So that was in 1875. She dies about 1890. Steiner, as far as I know, never met her. So he didn't actually ever know Blavatsky.
Hmm.
And when he was asked then, so what you were talking about before, we have in the East all this incredible mystery wisdom. Uh, but in the West, we have an ordering principle that maybe they didn't have anymore or didn't have, right? And that's the harmonic side happening there. So the idea is when those two things can be brought together, then the penetration into the spiritual world can actually become scientific. This is a very big deal, right? This is the birth, this was the blessing of science from Steiner's point of view, is it ordered the soul, tempered the soul, brought the soul into an objectivity that when love and devotion and all these other aspects are there too, allows for a penetration into the spiritual world that was unique in history as far as we know. And again, unique in history because the evolution of consciousness has us in a place and time by then that allows something to occur that couldn't occur before, maybe in the mystery schools. Stand corrected. The mystery schools, this did still occur, but it was, in a way that now it needs to be all over the world, as you guys were saying. So really, in Steiner, ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, we have the creation of the Theosophical Society for the purposes, here I go, for the purposes of
Yeah.
creating something on the earth that Rudolf Steiner could meet and it would hear him. Okay. I don't know where else he would have been heard. Think about that. Because the
Hmm.
materialism, that kind of prejudice was so profound. And he never talked about it much at all. And he was a man of letters, quite a guy in his own time, but all that spiritual experience that he couldn't share.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the Brockdorf people, who were the Theosophical group, and I believe it was in Berlin, asked him to give a talk. And on September 28th, 1900, he gave a talk on Goethe's Secret Revelation. And this was his first esoteric talk. And they were like, what? Steiner could see in the audience that there were ears to hear, right? And
Hmm.
they asked him back. So within 2 years, 1902, within 2 years, he was asked to become the general secretary of the entire German section of the Theosophical Society. And this is important that he declined. He said, no, I'm not going to do that because this path I have, I see what you're doing, and that's not the path that I'm taking. And they entreated him. They asked him a few times, and he said, okay, but I'm only going to speak out of my own spiritual research. He used a lot of the terminology in the early years from the Theosophical Society because he was a good teacher and he wanted to connect with his audience as they understood the spiritual world. But over time, he weaned them off that fairly quickly. The very first talk he gave, I think, as the secretary that evening, he gave one called Anthroposophy. Imagine, to another group of people. So a lot of people think, well, he was a theosophist. He actually never was a theosophist. He was always an anthroposophist. But again, he started there and then he started to build this up. And yeah, so that's a big deal. To me, we have an exemplar in Rudolf Steiner of what will humanity will look like if it could find its way through the difficulties we have right now, right? That we will have a creativity, a penetration into nature, a penetration into each other in our understanding and love. That Steiner is a gorgeous example to study his biography and stuff. I mean, it's staggering the beauty of his love, except that it just, you don't think that, but he really was about love in such an astonishing way. Um, Wonderful anecdotes about that. But there's a wonderful Owen Barfield. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. You guys have heard of Owen Barfield at all?
I have not.
I haven't.
Okay. Okay. Well, Owen Barfield, a very interesting man. He wrote quite a few books. They're all published by Wesleyan College Press. So he, in his own right, was a writer that was very revered. And he died at 99. He was a solicitor in England. And he met Steiner and, pow, he'd been studying the evolution of consciousness through language. He wrote a book called The History of English Words, where he looks at words in the past as fossilized examples of different forms of consciousness. This was way before he met Steiner. Okay, that
Love
kind of
that.
very cool. So anyway, he met Steiner. He says, my God, this guy's forgotten more than I'll ever know about the evolution of consciousness, kind of thing, right? And as the time went on, he had this wonderful phrase. He says, as the years went by, as I tried and wrestled with with coming to an understanding of the stature of Rudolf Steiner, it became a burden too excessive to be borne. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
It's just he realized that this was gigantic. What
I can
was in
relate.
front of him,
I
this
can
little
relate to
diminutive
that.
guy, was just gigantic. If I suppose if you could see him spiritually, he would just been massive. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So I see him that way.
A couple things. I think it's with the words theosophy versus anthroposophy, we see a very exact declination or a difference, right, between those traditions. One, theo, being more about the overall religiosity or the spiritual side of it, dealing with Mahatmas and, ascended masters and all that. And then anthroposophy, which is really about the human consciousness evolution, right? The anthro side, right? And I think that's a really important difference there, Dale, right? Would you say, like, why did did he ever describe why the differentiation there and anthroposophy versus theosophy?
I think so. First of all, his one of his books is in fact entitled, right, Theosophy.
Yeah.
So so that we can't really dismiss that quite as separatedly as you would kind of you suggested, right? I think that he just really sucked theosophy into anthroposophy ultimately, Um, so
And another question too,
Go
Dale,
ahead.
just on this, did he, and I know going back, I'm trying to think of some of the lectures, but did he do anything devoted specifically to the Mahatma, the tradition and his interfacing with them in the same way that Blavatsky and those guys did? Did he really go deep into that? I don't really remember much on that, but I may be wrong.
Well, let's say that to begin with, Steiner resisted theosophy because it was based on mediumistic trance knowledge. And he said that was appropriate 100, 200, 1,000 years ago. That was the normal way that the spiritual was penetrated by people. But it's atavistic, as he calls it, atavistic now. And if we entertain it, if we keep it alive, it will become more and more decadent, more and more subject to illusion, delusion, false paths that we'll take. And I just like, I just, go
we
ahead.
see that in the New Age movement.
We
very
see it in New
prominently.
Ageism, and in a sense, yeah, absolutely, and
And it was very trendy in spiritism at that time. I mean, that was the trend.
good.
Everyone going to
Historically.
seances and
Yep.
seeing spooks and specters. And really, a lot of it was their own creation from their own feelings, their own psychic emanations, and getting lost in that, right? And a lot of con men, too.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and Steiner's, when he asked us to do these exercises, if you've ever tried them, they're incredibly challenging, right? And the reason they're challenging, he says, is that the tempering of the soul that occurs objectifies what will become spiritual experience. It won't become something that you will recognize right away when you're moving away. And that's why it has to be the way it has to be. But a lot of people, no, I'll just do DMT, or I'll do this, or I'll space off in transcendental meditation exercises or whatever, and just lift myself out of myself. And man, does that feel good. You know, and as the world becomes more and more of a spiritual wasteland, I think it probably feels better and better and better all the time because, you know, we can't find it here, right? Very easily. I think we can, but we'll see how that goes. Yeah.
Yeah, there's
So
definitely a
that side.
discipline and a moral imperative around this too. Like you know, what I love about the Western side of the mysticism here is it understands there's evil too, and understands there's a will, right? There's a will at play versus that more Eastern sort of mystical monism, right? We could talk about that as well, but yeah, you referenced some of what Steiner's techniques. Would you want to go a little deeper into that? And I think this is very Rosicrucian from my,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, in a way, people say that, okay, so, and Barry, you'll appreciate this if you hadn't known it before, but and it's more anecdotal style. You know, again, initiates never talk about these things, but they do share them in personal conversations. And over time, these things can come back through anecdotally to us. That it's most probable, let's say it this way, that the master that initiated Steiner was Christian Rosenkreuz, literally.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Who then was Comte de St. Germain.
Exactly.
One of them, right? That's the confusion. Steiner says there were a lot of people named that, and there was one guy that was really the reincarnation of Rosencreutz.
And he was a very enigmatic figure by design, we'll say.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So we have Rosicrucianism, you might say, lineagely placed in Steiner's hands, right? But then we have other streams. And I think in Steiner and Anthroposophy, you'll see again a synthesis occurring because of science in the forms that it had, because of the Grail legends and what that was bringing, that all this then found its way into something new in the world, a spiritual path in the world that is called anthroposophy, spiritual science, right? And in it is Rosicrucianism in its most authentic form, in my opinion, but I'm not a scholar of that, you know, in that sense, to really know the differences. And okay, so the meditation is just a real short thing. So his idea was not that you try and eradicate your life of thought. You don't try to get rid of it. In fact, you take hold of it and try to bring it under your own control through exercises, daily rhythmic exercises, concentrating on pinheads and images like the rose cross and stuff. Holding that image, let's say, for 5 minutes and absolutely not letting any wandering occur of any kind. So that eventually he argues that over time, you will be able to do that. You will be able to hold that image absolutely fixed and powerfully in your consciousness, and no wandering of the thinking mind will occur. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so then you go, okay, well, okay, I got that down now. He says, and once you can do that, once you've strengthened your soul forces to that degree, now the real step comes. And that's what? That's to create that image and then suggest it away and hold that void that you now have accomplished. And when you do, the spiritual world will begin to stream in and communicate with you. That's in a nutshell, right? Yeah. Something incredible, lifelong or incarnations long to acquire, that we will acquire. That's part of you could argue the destiny of humanity is to eventually, and think about how the science that has asked us in so many ways to begin that process. I remember as a math person, you know, doing a problem and triple checking every step and being so careful, and my mind being under my ego, just taking hold of my thought life and really doing these steps and getting to the bottom and getting the wrong answer. What? No way. I've never done anything that so, you know, consciously in my life, and I still got it wrong. That's a wonderfully tempering, humbling thing that I think science can give us, especially things like math, right? Because if you don't have that, a lot of people do have a sort of natural easygoing egotism about their knowing. And I go, oh, you're probably just wrong really a lot of the time. I know I am wrong a lot of the time, and I have that advantage over you. You know, so that I worry about that a little bit, right? So that
I think
essence, go ahead. But then there are levels of that, right? And Mike, as you were talking about, Steiner says that, what's science done? The bad side of science is that to be the objective the way it was, it had to cut the human being out of the picture of nature. And the minute it did that, the harmony that we maybe even had at the time was just lost in a way. And especially with the efficacy of science getting stronger, now we're pumping chemicals into the earth and destroying the earth, getting amazing yields of something that isn't food. So the whole thing's a nightmare, kind of from an anthroposophically seen point of view. So Steiner's saying that when we return to the human being and really penetrate and understand the human being, we see, oh, I'm a spiritual being. I'm a spiritual being amongst spiritual beings, and I take that knowledge and turn it back out into the world. And that's anthroposophy, right? From the wisdom in the human being, you find the spiritual in the cosmos again. That probably in a nutshell is a way of seeing it. And there's beautiful examples of that, especially you guys have studied Waldorf schools and Waldorf education, seeing how they do that with kids. You know what I mean?
yeah. Well,
I
it's
go ahead.
a great exercise for me was just the practice of anthroposophical medicine because it was a very practical application. And for instance, you're aware that incoming sensory information, through the neurons and through the arterial system, it's, that's one half of your being that we could, maybe consider, one of the two hemispheres we're talking about. And then, but then that meets the venous and the cerebral spinal fluid at a certain junction. And then that is where life physicality experience is picked up through the astral body. And then, he explains how the astral body in turn models the physical body. So in the practice of medicine, when you understand these principles, they weren't just ideas because it gave you very important clues when you were able to, distinguish between metabolism and the astral influence and so forth, that you could do certain things that would actually make a difference in the physical body. So, it's very grounded and very practical. And one other interesting thing, you're talking about the integration of different levels of information. And he talked about, of course, music and the different octaves and correlated that with the periodic table of elements, and even did studies to show that when kids are given really fine-tuning exercises using their digits, which brings the eye into the seventh octave, with that kind of experience. That's just, I'm kind of jumping principles a little bit, but then that would correlate with the elements in the seventh octave, like trace mineral fluoride that is important for teeth development. And his study showed that, when kids did that, they had less dental caries than when, so all this stuff ties together. And to me, it's just, he connected a lot of dots, made it very practical. Mike, you were about to say something?
I was just going to say, not to mention also, Bear, related to neurology and the death cycle versus the life cycle within the body,
Yeah.
right, that we've talked about before. And then the etherization of blood, and the heart not being a pump. One of the first, really, I mean, that's become now pretty much mainstream. Well, I don't know about mainstream, but within our circles, very well understood. But yeah, there's just so much to understand about the inside out approach here, which is very hermetic in that sense, right? Very,
Nice.
right. And just common sense stuff that we can apply every day is such a deep, there's so much to what's brought. I mean, it's incredible.
Well, it's wonderful. Let's point to that because why do I consider him, besides the greatest preacher I ever heard, the greatest teacher? Well, what's better than creating worldwide occupations by a biodynamic farmer, anthroposophical doctor, eurythmist, a Waldorf teacher, that in and of themselves are each a spiritual path of development? Does it get any more beautiful than that? So, I mean, come on. And every one of them, every single thing he talked about became a worldwide thing. I mean, doesn't that just blow your mind? I mean, yeah,
I
we
think
could
that's good
adore
proof,
him for an
Dale.
hour.
I think that's pretty sound proof because the critics of Steiner would say that he often gets lost in mysticism or story and narratives that are fantastical and fantasy. But he was very keen on expressing this idea of spirit science and related to personal objective experience, right? That you can test. And it's clear that he was tapping into these realms where in the East they would maybe call it the Akashic record, or in the West maybe the field, or we could relate it to analogy of the computer, right? This is the database he's tapping into. But it's true, it seems very clear because of the application of this stuff brought out to the world that's been proven and tested time and time. Like there's no better proof than agriculture, right? If it works with plants, I mean, that's pretty soundproof. So it seems very clear that the legacy of this, we look back towards what he was talking about, is sound evidence, just logically, that he was having these real experiences in these other realms, in the astral and the etheric, and interrelating with the hierarchies that he talks about as well, which can seem quite fantastical to many on the more scientific mind, but bridging those two together once again.
Well, he was respected in Europe at the time because he was who they called on to solve a potential famine issue, and that's, I believe, where biodynamic farming was born. Is that true?
You know, I don't know that story. Could you tell us
Hmm?
more about that? I don't remember about
Yeah,
that.
so countries in Europe, I believe Germany, were actually looking at famine. Their farming
Right.
practices were
Okay.
um, were not enriching the soil over generations, and they were not able to have the same yield in their crops anymore. So they called in Rudolf Steiner, who taught them biodynamic farming and how to re-enrich the soil so that they could again grow enough food for the people. And he single-handedly, through that, turned the whole situation around.
Yeah, that's nice. So, yeah, Count Kaiserlink, right? In
I believe so, yeah.
in Silesia area, and they had pestered him
Hmm.
for many years to do an
Hmm.
agricultural cycle of
Hmm.
lectures, and eventually, he said, just make sure. He said he sent his nephew there. He said, just make sure he pulls out his appointment book. If he does, he'll come.
Yeah, that's great.
Pulls it out and writes
But
down the dates. So
but
yeah,
that should do a lot to quell the critics that accused him of just being overly a mystic. He's a pretty grounded guy.
yeah. That the word mystic is completely misapplied. I mean, utterly
Yeah.
so. He critiques mysticism and talks about it not in a black and white way, but that it's it's just not a word maybe that's healthy anymore. I'm sure aspects of
Hmm.
his experience could be termed mystical, but he was a spiritual scientist. Really is the best phrase I think.
Hmm.
Yeah. Have you ever heard this wonderful thing where he talks about the bodies? Okay, we have physical body, etheric body,
Hmm.
astral body, ego.
Right.
The higher ones, the transformed astral is called
Hmm.
spirit self, and the transformed etheric is called life spirit, right?
Mhm.
And there's this wonderful
Hmm.
place in Arts and Their Mission. Have you guys ever heard this? Where he's talking about how, and I'm going to say it, he says it this way. I don't know if he does say it this way, but so he's looking at architecture and he says, when you look at architecture, you're really seeing the human being experiencing the physical forces of their physical organism. And in the experience of that, when that manifests in the world, you get architectural forms that we see, buildings and huts and all that.
Hmm.
So when you look at sculpture, he says a clairvoyant, when a person is doing sculpture, the clairvoyant sees a special condition occur in the sculptor, and that is that their forces of their etheric body are pressing into their physical body in a special way. You ever heard
Hmm.
that before? In case I'm repeating
Yeah,
this.
absolutely.
Okay,
And
and then
and what is no, you continue. I had a question for you, but continue your thought.
so then we get the unfolding of the arts. So then from that we get to painting. Well, in painting, they're just such gorgeous pictures if you study these bodies over the years, and then you read this all of a sudden, like 15 years later, right? So then you have the astral body pressing into the etheric body in painting. And
Mm-hmm.
then in music, you have the ego pressing into the astral. But well, of course you do. I mean, what's so bizarre is how there's such perfect explanations, right? And
Yep.
then when you hear poetry, you have the spirit self pressing into the ego, and that's not really here yet. And so you can see in poetry where you almost have an art form that's sort of on the edge of becoming. And some people kind of realize it more than others, but it's still not here. And then finally, in eurythmy, we have this idea of the life spirit pressing into the spirit self. So that really is something to come in the future. I always found that such a compelling, strangely satisfying picture of these things. So, okay, got that out of my system.
So there's a name. It's a center that still exists in Europe. I forget the term, but it's a play on the name Goethe, the Goethe-Arium or something.
Oh, you
Are
mean
you
Steiner's
familiar with
building,
that?
the Goetheanum?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, gotcha.
Couldn't remember that term, but that isn't that exactly an exemplification of what you're talking about as far as these principles applied to architecture and art?
Yeah, he was describing anybody doing any art that these
Hmm.
realities are bodies pressing into each other in the ways that they do. That's what's occurring when you're doing an art. That's maybe one of the reasons we're so
Exactly.
satisfied. Yeah, but so the first Goetheanum, of course, was burned down by arson on New Year's Eve, 1922 to 1923,
Hmm.
right? And that was an extraordinary building. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen that or if you put pictures up of things, but there's an actual miniature of it that a man meticulously built at the Goetheanum, the second Goetheanum they have now, where you can go to the center of it and put your head up into the inside of the Goetheanum and look around in there. I don't know if you're either. I think that's on YouTube, maybe even as well. Uh, yeah. So then the second Goetheanum was built out of freeform concrete, probably the first structure in the world built that way. And Le Corbusier, one of the famous architects, was very appreciated that building very much, which still stands. And that's the center for the School of Spiritual Science in the world. The General Anthroposophical Society is there. Yeah.
So
Okay.
could maybe there we talk a little bit about Goethe and his influence on Steiner, and I think was Steiner did a whole treatise on Goethe as part of his graduate studies and so forth. A great little book that kind of gets into all that. You know, you've
No, I love
probably
that.
seen this one, Man
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Man.
yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. But just about the Steiner and Goethe connection. So. Um, is there any way to distill that down into our conversation to just understand more what the connection was there?
Yeah.
It's a pretty
I think
heady subject.
Steiner saw in okay. So what we had were let's take one example. Here's a good example in terms of the theory of color, and that
Hmm.
is let's look at regular phenomenology. Okay, regular phenomenology. We're paying attention to the phenomenon objectively of the world, and we have Newton, and he's in a dark room, and he's got a prism by a window, and he opens the curtain, right? He opens the curtain, and when he opens the curtain, the light comes in through the prism, shines on the wall. He gets the seven colors, and then begins his analysis of color, right?
Hmm.
That's the picture that we have. So
Yep.
this irritated Goethe about a 100 years later. He just didn't like that. So he got some prisms from some fancy baron, and he had them for a while. And of course, with all the other things he was doing, he never got around to what he'd hoped to do, right? And so he sent his nephew there. He says, I want my prisms back. And so Goethe goes all the way to the end of his house and grabs this fancy, let's imagine box with all these carefully enclosed prisms in it. And he turns around and he's walking back to give them to this guy. And he opens up this thing and he takes a prism out. Well, what does Goethe do with the prism? Do you guys know what he does with it? Have you ever heard this before? Well, Goethe,
Yeah,
Oh
but please
yeah.
go ahead.
he puts it to his own eyes and looks through it. Now think of the two.
Exactly.
And we call Goethe's methodology, you could call it romantic phenomenology, right?
Hmm.
Where the qualitative is not lost, or at least is carefully compartmentalized. So the minute he does it, he goes, oh my God, Newton is wrong. I can't give you these back. And then he proceeded then to write the theory of color as it was. And what he found, one of the big things he found, if you recall, is wherever he found, in the room, shadow and light forming a boundary, the
Hmm.
rainbow would explode into being. All right. So then he began this whole thing and all these studies. For instance, one of the astounding things I love to bring up, and I do this all the time just for fun with people, is is Goethe's, claim, his casual remark that light itself is invisible. You can't see light itself. How's that sound?
Yeah, you see the things that are illuminated
By it.
by it.
Exactly. And that you don't get to,
And
and
he
if you
talked
think of that,
about the sun being an example of that, where the sun isn't there physically, and what we see as the rays is something else. So I think that ties in with what you're saying
incandescence
there.
and particles in
Yeah.
the air being reflected. I mean, you think at night, I love at night. Well, the sun's behind us. I mean, when I look out into the sky, that is saturated with sunlight, like to beat the band, right? I can't see it unless the moon comes and I what do I see? Well, I don't see the light. I see the moon, the image of the moon that the light bestows upon me. And so Steiner will take that, and I don't know if Goethe did as well, but talks about the perfect selflessness of light, right? That it itself remains invisible, but bestows our entire world of sight upon us, of all objects, of all shapes and everything. So I remember, I'll say that to people who go, "You're nuts." They just say, "You're crazy. Of course you can see light." I go, "Well, just take your time. Just take your time and really, really think it through and see if you agree with yourself after some real serious pondering. Because what else am I going to say to them? I mean, I can't say they're wrong because they see what they see. I see what I see. It's fascinating this way, right? So they just need to take their time. I'm pretty convinced from careful study that I can't see light. All right. So anyway, so that's an example of, and Goethe then tried to experienced the behavior of light through various media, right? And he talked about turgid medium and a turgid medium and seeing light through darkness or seeing darkness through light gives you two completely different experiences over and over and over. And Beethoven considered it one of the greatest books he ever read was Goethe's Theory of Color, which is kind of fascinating. Now,
Especially when you relate color to music, because we've done shows on that, and there's a lot
synesthesia
of
kind of thing, is that the
yeah.
idea?
Well, that's one effect of it, but we're talking about the causal nature of reality here, and we talked about the spheres of the heavenly bodies and relating to each having their own chord and sound and there's all this that Steiner talks about too, and how really color and sound are and light in essence and sound are really both a perturbation of the field, the etheric field, and are really very much the same thing. And so we're talking about the qualitative measurements once again that the color represents. And didn't Goethe talk about? I'm trying to remember it's been a while since I've looked into the prism experiment. There's something to do with the darkness too, right? The shadow that has been denied, and this balance between the light and the shadow. I'm trying to remember. I mean, there's so many fascinating things about him as in Goethe. If you will look him up, just if you guys haven't heard of him, and his name is spelled. For those that I remember when I was first hearing about Goethe back in the day, Dale, on YouTube, I didn't know how to spell his name, and so I'd go try to find him, and I could never find him. It's Goe, T-H-E, guys,
THE.
and he's Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And he's often considered to be like just a poet in the mainstream conventional way, if you just look him up. But really, he was a natural philosopher. He was a true
Nice.
scientist in that way. And his studies too, Bear and I have talked in the past about plant life and how plants grow and all that. Extremely important for, I think, the evolution of where Steiner came out of. And what do you got there? There you go. The Metamorphosis of Plants. Bear's got the book.
Yeah. So, yeah, and there's books, just talking about
Beautiful.
color that we just, yeah, and this is very important. I farm predominantly these days, and when you understand what's in this book, Goethe's principles, it's same as Anthroposophical, and it really helps you become a better farmer. You mentioned Beethoven. When you get into anthroposophical understandings of how the sensory apparatus of our body's hearing, sight actually works, it explains why Beethoven, being deaf, could compose all that he did, because you're not hearing with your outer ear. And going into Goethe, he was just endeavoring, I believe, to, let's just say, assess our reality in a fuller, more complete way, and not just operating on the outer neural sensory.
He talked about that his training he described as uh, cultivating our subjective nature into an objective state. So he called it sensorially exact fantasy.
Yeah.
Cool phrase. Sensorially exact fantasy. And so, like the metamorphosis of plants, can I so understand the unfolding? Now, then this is imagination combined with phenomenology. That's why I like to call it romantic phenomenology, so that you don't lose that. So that I could myself imagine a plant unfold lawfully unfold that doesn't exist in nature. That was kind of the goal of the Urpflanze, study, right? Finding the archetypal plant. So I, by the way, have the theory of color recorded. I was asked
Yes.
to do that by a group, and that I don't know if that's anywhere else but on my main site. But right on the front page, there's a download of the book.
I'll make sure to put that in the show
Yeah,
notes below. And going back to that theory of color and light and darkness, I remember now. So Goethe would say that darkness isn't the absence of light, but it's a polar to it, right?
I think
So
that's
the interaction with those two polarities is where we get color.
there you
And
go. Nicely.
that is very in line and in tune with Steiner's sensibility around the polarity of Ahrimanic and Luciferian. You
Nice.
know,
I never thought of it before. Yeah, yeah.
there's a
Very.
parallel there.
Yeah, yeah. I think so.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the Goethe is sort of preceding Steiner. There are so many, there's a lot of influence there, right? He was heavily influenced by
So what
Goethe.
happened was after Steiner got his degree when he was 20, I believe he was 26, 24 or 26, he was asked to be the editor of the scientific writings of Steiner for what was called the Kirchner edition, and later another one called the Sophie edition or Sophia edition. He did work in both of those. So he had that influence. I mean, everybody had the influence of Goethe because of Faust and Wilhelm Meister and so many of his books. He was really the first superstar, you might say, of well, besides Shakespeare in England. I mean, he's probably the first superstar in the continent in that sense. Yeah, but to say, and Steiner went past him. Now, did he use the methodologies of Goethe, or was it just that, in the organic wisdom that you have, they simply were parallel and so similar to each other? We see one as influencing the other. I actually don't know that. I'm not saying what didn't happen.
That
I
was
kind
going to
of
be
think it did,
my
but
question to you is, how much he was influenced or just
right.
running parallel.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. I tend to think not. I tend to think of Steiner as severely original. But then he looks out into the world, right? All the time. His library when he died was over 9,000 volumes, of which a good chunk was in English, interestingly enough, right? That he looked out and saw these, and when he saw Goethe, he went, "Oh, this guy got this far in what I do." And then glom to it
Hmm.
in the scientific sense. As you said, Mike, they wasn't even then regarded as a scientist at all
Yeah, yeah,
until
yeah.
until later, until I don't know when. I mean, I don't know if anybody pays any attention to him at all now, but except for in anthroposophy. And they do, the whole entire Goethe on the Goetheanum stage, both parts one and two. It's quite a long drama there. And they've all done that for, almost 100 years now when they do it. So, and then Steiner wrote 4 mystery dramas, and they do those there as well. I don't know if you know about those. He was also a playwright.
Wow, I was not aware of that.
I have those recorded, but I do have advance apologies for those on the website, and they're completely unusual. I mean, you would not expect. You just, if you listen to them, you're going to have a hard time. But Ahriman's in there and Lucifer's in there. And there's these pretty much 16 people. And in the 4 plays, he's taking you through certain eons of time to try to show the relationships between their reincarnations. I try to give a
Wow.
picture in drama form of what reincarnations could look like. Yeah. So he's got them in Egyptian times,
So,
medieval times, and in the modern
mhm.
times. Go ahead.
So did he believe that these two figures actually embodied in physical form?
From his research, we can't, as far as I know, we can't ever really use the word belief with Steiner.
Hmm.
He had research. He did scientific research in the spiritual world. He talks about an incarnation of Lucifer in China about 3000 BC
Hmm.
and argues that that really then became the foundation for all the culture that erupted in the East at that time,
Mhm.
so that everything there. And
So it's
then
coming out of that, the Buddhist tradition, the Taoist tradition, all that, coming out of that Luciferic character. And does he ever mention that person in name?
no, not that I'm aware of. Yeah,
No.
that's a good question. It's actually a good question. And then the argument that there'll be an incarnation of Ahriman sometime in our time. And then the incarnation of Christ. And then there was also this incarnation in the Mayan times of a black magician. He talks about in a set of lectures I don't enjoy reading called The Inner Impulses of Evolution and the Mexican Mysteries. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but I put that up there, but that kind of puts a shiver down my spine, that kind of thing. I can't remember why he did that. There was a reason why he needed to share that information. Yeah.
Could
But
that relate to Atlantis and the diaspora around that?
yeah, when
Eh,
was that? Yeah, I don't
uh,
think so. I mean, all that's gonna relate to that, but
yeah.
I interrupted you. Go ahead, continue.
Well, no, I was just gonna say because there's a tradition around Mayans and having um, the Balal, sons of Balal, I believe, and this comes sort of out of Casey, Edgar
Okay.
Casey, and his
I'm a big fan.
his. Are you or not? Did you
I am
say?
a big
Oh,
fan,
big
yeah.
fan, yeah. Well, there's a lot of synchronicity and stuff. Actually, there's this great YouTube channel called The Dark Journalist. Are you
Yes.
familiar with his work?
Yeah.
And so that's like sort of his big thing is he's merged a lot of Steiner's work with Edgar Casey in terms of trying to figure out the Atlantis story. And there is some really interesting out of Casey especially, but this idea of the diaspora with the collapse of Atlantis on the final collapse, how there's this sons of Balal who were using the two-eye stone he called that was this technology they ended up destroying, but it was very Ahrimanic. They were very Ahrimanic, and they had moved to where the Mayans were, and that was sort
I
of
see. I
their
see.
continuity there, as well as moving to Europe. And there's questions on who those people ended up being, whether they be the Scythians or um the Datu Anani or whatever, up in the Celts that ended up being the Celts
Oh,
and stuff. So this is all fantastic, like interesting anthropology, that comes out of the research between Casey and Steiner. But yeah, I think it's all important for us to be aware of, because if anything, there's lessons there in terms of the Ahrimanic technology that relates to Atlantis and what Steiner would coin the eighth sphere, right? Do you have much, I don't know, ideas around this? Maybe we could explain what we mean by the eighth sphere, and sort of the
Yeah,
warnings
that's
that Steiner has about that
ex-
with technology where we are now.
exactly what I was just about to bring up. And of course, that ties into a lot of present day theories that the dark forces are trying to open up portals to embody an Ahriman type of figure in order to trap people in what Steiner described as the eighth sphere. So, yeah, uh, anything in your research that has brought that up?
well, I've read those lectures, but they're so incredibly subtle that I've never gotten
Hmm.
my head properly around it as Steiner describes it. And when I listened a little bit to the Dark Journalist on it, I just didn't feel that I was getting the way Steiner understood it, but I couldn't correct him yet because I myself wasn't clear on it. But I thought he's a little off on that. You know what I mean? So not that I know he is.
Yeah, yeah,
It
yeah,
just
yeah.
felt that way. Yeah, I don't have a very I something to share on it that would be strong. I'm afraid to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm certainly
And
aware of it. Go ahead.
my
Yeah.
initial comments about AI and Steiner being prophetic about that, again, he doesn't really called out by that, but there is a series where he's talking about Ahriman kind of making a deal with Lucifer that he is to be given all the data. And then, of
Huh?
course, people ran with that and saying, oh, the data, which is what AI is doing in order to be a controlling mechanism. So, whether that's authentically what Steiner was seeing or not, I don't know, but that's, where those kinds of theories come from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm very much interested in the mystery of Golgotha again, and how that interplays with today and everything that's going on in the Middle East. And it seems like things are coming to a head there, and there's definitely a lot of power, forces at play here. Does this all synchronize with what Steiner was, saying or concerned about with that region and sort of I don't know, what's your take on all this that's going on right now there?
There are a lot of people, I think, that read some Steiner and feel, I don't want to step on toes here, but they feel it gives them a special window of understanding that they don't think other people have. And then they kind of make stuff up afterward. And I go, yeah, and I don't know. And I'm not disagreeing with anything, right? I'm just saying I don't feel that Steiner gives me any special insight into the complexities of the quagmire, the dark crud called politics in the world, right? I'm pretty simple-minded about this. I look at the bizarre way through that we've allowed the concentrations of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. And that's simply going to create an imbalance of such grotesque proportions that the simple nod of a person's head can kill 100,000 people in an hour. Okay, to me, this is all gone crazy. You know what I mean? And I don't have any special insight. This doesn't come from Steiner or anybody. I read Chomsky. I read Howard Zinn. I listen to Doug Henwood on Behind the News. You know, I read a lot of those people because they're not rich and because they care to me about a moral world, even if they're rationalists and materialists. I don't care.
Well, in Steiner's time, no, we had World War I and coming into World War II. He spoke
uh-huh.
about that a lot and the warnings around that, right?
Yeah, what could you say about how he would see that? And there's a ton of lectures, by the way, on that. I'm actually
Yeah.
going to do more books that finally got published on it. You know, but I would say, you know, it would be similar to what I saw see in the world still, and that was, you know, I don't know if you know this, but Germany didn't even become an actual modern state until 1871.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't even a nation state,
A
right?
bunch of
So once they,
principalities.
go ahead.
It was just a bunch of
Yeah, all these
principalities.
principalities. So once they started organizing and, of course, establishing their own military, that was a big part of it, right? And all that, and because they were so huge and you know going to be influential in Europe, you know, France and Britain especially really got on them, and there was a lot of pressure and a lot of uh, uh, tension that was created because of what was happening. And when the war finally broke out, because as we know of all these intermarriages that caused all these old contracts to just, you know, by inertia, just kick into gear and everybody starting to kill everybody. And nobody really could remember exactly why they were doing that. Uh, yeah, you know, at the end of it, Steiner was worried that Germany was going to be the only one that was going to be blamed for that. He said that's not an accurate understanding of history. So he really worked hard to try to bring that about, that the blame of these other countries and their own aggressive orientations toward what was going on could be acknowledged. And of course they weren't. And so you had this idiotic reparations that were impossible to fulfill for Germany, which essentially kind of drove a nation insane to the point of actually hiring, you know, Hitler as their guy, you know. And yeah, I
Yeah,
don't know.
Bear and I have
I'm pretty pedestrian about my understanding of politics in that sense, right?
yeah, yeah.
I'm not.
We're the same way, and I think this relates back to Steiner's inside out approach, is that is the solution. The politics is never the solution, and in diving into the narratives and drama around it's just a sideshow. It's just going to distraction, and that's why people like Steiner are so important, is because really the solution is within each one of us. And yeah, I was just curious there because I know I've listened to a bunch of those lectures around the World War and stuff, and Bear and I have also discussed in here around the sort of falsification of history related to even to the Nazis and stuff, and how there's a lot of there's a lot of nonsense out there that isn't truly true history.
Yeah, now you're now you're into prime censorship material. And while
Yeah.
we're into prime censorship, why don't we go into some of Steiner's reputed thoughts on serums, vaccines, and what was really behind the Spanish flu epidemic?
Let's
Do you
try not to
have
say
any
that V
information
word,
on that?
though. Let's try not to see
Yeah.
that, say that V word. That's the one thing in YouTube we'll get shut down for.
I see. I see. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, again, I'm certainly wary of all that stuff to some extent, and I've never been a person who got vaccines for flus or anything. Um, yeah, but
Let's just say he
Steiner was
was
vaccinated for smallpox, right, and all this stuff, and he talked about
hmm,
fanaticism. He worried
interesting.
about people becoming overly fanatic about it, but at the same time, saw materialism and saw the nefarious aspects of this too. So, I don't, again, I don't, it's interesting, you guys, but in the physical world, in the modern issues of my life, uh, I go with the best practices of the goodwill of the people around me that I can find, that I feel are good people. And I don't know they're good people. I do the best I can, but I don't lay anything on this from anything Steiner said in a certain sense, really. I never liked vaccines, so I stayed away from them. I don't know why. It was because I read Steiner. You know what I mean? I don't fix something that isn't broken, as it were. You know what I mean? When the
Well,
COVID thing came along and I had friends die and I'm like, what's going on? So I got the vaccines. I just did. But I thought I may die from these. It's absolutely possible I could die from these. Okay. But I'm going to do it for everybody else just to make sure that,
mhm.
but I don't know anything about it is true or false. I don't pretend to know. And that's just the direction I went. Yeah. So,
Yeah, I believe a lot of the thoughts on Steiner being maybe not a contagion theorist is because he did uncover or give some thoughts publicly about what he thought was the true cause of the Spanish epidemic, flu epidemic, which was actually the first rollout of the crude electronic grid in which, in Europe, people had to accommodate their neurology, including their energetic bodies. And he described, if it's authentic, but just what I've read, that that allowed a kind of a herd adaptation response, which made a lot of people sick. But then after the adaptation was made, then that's when the actual epidemic ended. And he said it wasn't because of a contagion. He said, however, though, because of that forced adaptation, that the herd, the population was not as vital as they were before.
sure.
And so, yeah.
What about the Black
And of
Death? Did you ever
course,
talk about the bubonic plague? Do you remember him
I
discussing?
haven't heard anything about
Okay.
that, Mike. Have you heard anything about? I've never seen that connection.
Yeah.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, we get deep into, and again, this is just prime censorship material, but in our other formats, including our private membership groups, we go deep into germ theory and the flaws and so forth. And I was part of a movie with some brilliant medical doctors, researchers, virologists. It's called Terrain. It's on Prime Amazon right now. You can watch it. And so I was in that, and we kind of talk from our professional experience on what we see as being true and untrue about conventional medical theories, we'll say,
Sure. Sure.
and what was really behind the last so-called epidemic.
I see.
Bear, did Steiner ever go into like a miasma type theories at all as well? Because that would seem to sort of fit his sensibilities around.
Absolutely. Now,
Yeah.
you correct me if I'm wrong here, Dale, but I don't know if he uses that term per se, but everything you understand in anthroposophical is the fact that you have these influences, from the astral plane that actually are the prime modeling forces of our physicality in the first place. And again, anthroposophical medicine is about understanding both poles and then addressing them equally in a practice so that you're not just treating the physical, but understanding the influences that are going to turn around and create the physical in the first place. So, and there's ways to do that with different homeopathic preparations and other practices. I was a big fan of osteopathy because you can manipulate and bring to balance the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid, which is where the physical meets the etheric, or the etheric meets the astral, and you could do a lot to change things on the astral that would then change the physical. So that's even though Steiner wasn't talking about a lot of these modalities that people like myself adapted over the years, we're still understanding the same thing and applying modalities with that understanding.
Yeah, I think they're extrapolations, right? That makes sense. No, I love
Yeah,
that stuff. And homeopathy has always been incredibly fascinating to me.
yeah,
And I use a number of the medicaments. So yeah.
Nice.
yeah. And of
Yeah.
course, when you're in the homeopathy, then you're classically addressing miasms. There are certain miasm homeopathic
So tell me
preparations
what that
versus
word
other kind
means,
of remedies.
miasm. I've heard it, but I don't know.
Miasm would be, well, let's just look at an example. You look at an individual from a particular family, and we notice that the apple doesn't drop far from the tree. You kind of have the same quirks that your parents and grandparents have. Now, a miasm would be like more of a larger collective quirk, we'll call it.
Oh,
For instance, when we're talking about the cancer miasm, which I would describe as not a disease, but a cancer terrain, a condition that creates certain uh, symptoms that we consider a disease. But the cancer miasm was explained outgrowth of a time in Atlantis when there was a certain domineering, let's just say, minority of people that were imposing their will on the majority. And because the majority did not gather their will force sufficiently in order to just say no, that created this energetic predisposition that was then generationally passed down. And when you have when you do not have the ability or to muster up drawing your line in the sand, so forth, then certain microscopic events that are just normal in the body start, the tail starts wagging the dog. And then you have, certain cells that, start doing things at the expense of the overall body and so forth. So, and there's different primary miasms, the cancer, the TB, and, serinum, and each one of those has a story as far as a root race that created this collective predisposition of energetic that is still, carrying down through the human, we'll call it genome, which genome, to me means energetic, not some, molecular configurations of DNA. So I don't know if that makes any
What's the
sense.
intelligent design there behind that? I'm still trying to wrap my head now. Is it so we talk about symptoms and their messages to us, for us to evolve our consciousness. That's how the body, is interacting with us. Bear, what's the design? Why do we have these miasms? Do you know?
I don't know. Why do we have any experience at all? That gets into
It's a
some
great
larger
question.
principles of, yeah,
well, we have karma, right? I mean, that's an easy
Yes.
answer.
yeah.
There's also those interesting in the esoteric lessons. Steiner talks about, for instance, uh, the eating of animals. I'm not a vegetarian, but the eating of animals is such that there's a karmic consequence from this that arises through bacteria that become uh,
Hmm.
that become actually something that attacks us even now and in future incarnations, et cetera, et cetera. They're really wild kind of things, you know what I mean? But so that somewhat ties, I think, into this whole idea of why.
Yeah, it's basic
Yeah,
cause and effect, right?
yeah, kind of
Um,
is. Yeah, spiritual, if anything. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, like if we affront nature in certain ways, those repercussions will come through the timeline
yeah, yeah.
to affect us later on. And Barron mentioned something interesting, this idea of a root race. And maybe we could touch on that a little bit in the evolution of consciousness of the human. Steiner talked a lot about that, right? These different root races and the sort of the epochs, which is really interesting stuff.
He actually changed the root race terminology over time. That was from Theosophy, and
Mhm.
he used it at first. But I don't think he ever liked it. I think what he liked were the cultural epochs that you're talking about, which is what, and I don't know if they're perfectly replaceable with each other. I'm not even actually sure of that. But I was going to mention, though, somebody told me, and I don't remember if I read it in Steiner, Bar, I wanted to mention what you, if you'd heard this before, that in the old moon evolution, before the Earth, there was a period when our sense organs were being developed in this kind of
Hmm.
spiritual condition. And somebody said to me, I don't know, I think it was one of the priests maybe, said that we could also see in cancer an atavistic arising of old moon conditions in us, where our body tries to create sense organs inappropriately in the organism. You ever heard that before?
Well, I know in the old moon, it kind of follows the old hermetic etheric mechanisms, the stratifications of the ether. And the old moon correlated with the water element, but it also, Steiner described how spiritual beings, not in physical embodiment, in the old moon era gave their astral body to the ether so that we could then develop, humanity could develop that aspect within themselves that would then give rise to the physical body. And as far as tying in with cancer, not sure what that is. I can take a little stab with the real quick, the eating of animal flesh. In the Saint Germain Foundation, they just say, not a good idea, and that someday we'll look back upon carnivorism as we do cannibalism now. But that's not
Yeah. No,
attacking paleos. I don't want to get into that one because it triggers
sure.
everybody. But the bacteria thing, what I do know just about looking at bacteria and organisms under the blood, for about 40 years, is that you've probably heard this. The concept of pleomorphism. In other words, we have seeds of organism, and then they develop through 16 stages. Three of the stages are these bacterial phases. And in that phase, bacteria are scavengers, and their job is to eat up old, decaying flesh and things in our bodies that, need to be renewed. Now, when you're eating flesh from a different source, then those bacteria are then stimulated from their seed form to stay in that bacterial form. We call the higher valence more permanently in our body because they need to clean up this foreign flesh product, DNA that's foreign to our body, and because they become more let's just say like house guests that won't go away because they're trying to do something on our behalf. They not only start scavenging, the foreign flesh, but also our own. And aging and death is literally these scavengers gobbling us up, kind of returning us to the soil while we're still trying to use our body, if any of that makes sense. So
Yeah, no, that's really cool.
yeah, yeah. So not saying it's bad or you're going to go to hell if you eat meat or that you should eat any one thing or the other. I do what feels good to me, and I could care less what other people eat. I don't like diet based on ideologies, but since you bring that up, there are kind of rationalizations which you can draw just from practicing medicine and observing what's actually happening in people's blood. If you look at thousands and thousands of people's blood, under the microscope over a lot of years.
Yeah, yeah. So when you were
So
talking
kind
about
of a tangent.
the
Sorry
evolution of
about that.
consciousness, Mike, what did you want to talk about particularly? I, you had the Indian epoch, the Persian epoch, the Egypto-Chaldean epoch, the fourth, the Greco-Latin, and then now we're in this fifth post-Atlantean, as he calls them. So was there something you wanted to
I was
discuss?
just curious what if we could sort of, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the trend of, is there a evolutionary trend that we've seen through these? And is this sort of spiraling, if you will, escalating towards greater evolution of consciousness? Is this an up and down thing? Can you
Hmm,
not define it that way? And how can we apply that to where we are right now?
that's great. That's really a good question. And I'm sure
because
you guys have.
there's a lot. It's interesting. Are you familiar with the physicist Tom Campbell? He
Not that
Oh,
name.
he was just on Joe Rogan last week, and we actually interviewed him, Bear, if you remember, about 4 years ago.
I
And
remember that.
yeah, he's got this
Interesting gentleman.
yeah, his big toe, the theory of everything, and he basically worked with the famous out-of-body experiencer from the 1960s. What's his name? Who wrote all
Moody?
those great books?
Moody?
And the what? I'm sorry.
Moody?
Not Moody.
Okay, okay.
And he worked with even the CIA and stuff. Someone in the chat help me here. He was the original person my dad connected me with as I started practicing out of body stuff. Anyways, this was in the 60s and the 70s. Someone in the chat will say. But the reason why I bring this up is because there's this idea that and he relates the parallel between us living in literally like a simulation, and he uses the analogy of a computer program, and that consciousness is here to essentially evolve, and that's the point of it, is to progress forward to greater and greater evolution. Robert Monroe, thank you, Buddha Yoga. If you're familiar with Robert Monroe's work.
No, not familiar.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So he was very instrumental in really uncovering the phenomenon of the out-of-body experience or astral projection. And so, and I'm curious, my two-part question here is, does Steiner go deeper into that, into astral projection, and what is that, and what are the, how do we use that in the spirit science? And then two, how do we, in terms of like Tom Campbell, and because so he used that as scientifically along with Monroe to really prove out that, wow, consciousness is much more than the physical, much more than the material. We are really in a place here that isn't as physical as the materialists want to say, because we can literally prove that through our own personal experience of leaving our physical body through this specific technique and these different types of techniques. And then the overall basis being that, well, consciousness is progressing towards greater and greater evolution of consciousness. How can we relate that to Steiner, the epochs, and does Steiner go in at all into the astral projection process?
He's never used that phrase that I'm aware of, unless the translators changed it or whatever. So my picture of that is that when Steiner was developing his inner life, he was able to access his memory life better and better until he got to, and this is kind of my description, not Steiner's, where he got to that boundary where your memories begin, okay, around 2.5, 3 years old. And as an initiate, there's a threshold experience there where he could pass through that and go before then. And when he did, he began to have memories that weren't his own memories. They were the memories of what comes to be called the Akashic Record, the Akashic Chronicle, which is the earth having all the memories of all the thinking, feeling, and willing of human beings embodied in it. And that's because the earth is there literally as the gadget that we're using, and actually is part of what we were, that we extricated out of ourselves over the eons, right? So that we could have an outer world to stand on and grow our egos out of. So the whole earth itself is literally part of our body that we put outside ourselves, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Gaia, you have the Gaia hypothesis and Sheldrake's work and stuff. So then Steiner, because he was wide awake, because he wasn't in trance form, and this is a big deal, right, in the anthroposophical path, could move in that world and do scientific research. He could enter into the soul life of the Romans. And out of their inner life, he could talk about history, right? Wow. Okay, the Babylonians, the Atlanteans, the Lemurians, and then further back even than that. And we get this all from this picture, right? So when we ask what is the consciousness going to look like, I always say, well, you've got Steiner. Take a look.
Yeah.
There it is so far, right, that I know of, right? Now, I don't know if astral projection fits into that in a way. That could be another form of spiritual experience that we can have. and I don't have an opinion on it. I would prefer to go with Steiner because I think it's safer. I don't know. I've heard of people that get lost, in astral projection and that kind of thing can happen. Why is that happening? It must be some methodological flaw that maybe they shouldn't, should we be playing around with it? On the other hand, given our horrid materialism and the prejudices and conceits of our culture, people like Casey, who I don't like how he did it, I like that he was an example of something that you can't just dismiss. These 14,000 readings and
especially the medical
and even the invention of the searchlight that they use in airports was invented by him and all these things. And I like that not because per se of him, but because I can throw it in the face of people and go, look, the world isn't the way you really think it is. You need to calm down and expand your ideas and think more about what is an astral body, and think about, we talk about Archimedean levers. I've loved this picture one day. It came to me, that's Archimedes could say, give me a fulcrum and in a place in space, and I could use a lever to move the earth, right? I can move it. I got to get far enough. And I think to myself, well, what are we going to do in the materialistic age we're in? What Archimedean levers do we have that could possibly start to move people out of the profound dogma of materialism? Dogma of materialism. And I think of the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the ego as these aren't just dreamy ideas, right? In Steiner, they're concretely done in medicine. They're concretely used in agriculture. They're concretely used everywhere. So if you wonder what they're about, you could study all these perspectives on the nature of those things. But ultimately, when you finally start to get a deeper and deeper picture of them, they're worlds of the spirit. That's simply what they are. Isn't that gorgeous?
And if you study...
Go ahead.
In anthroposophical medicine, you understand it's not about trying to leave your body into some astral plane. It's understanding how to unify the two and understand how one creates the other, and it goes full circle. I know we're coming up on time here a little bit, and you've been very generous with us, but one more question that might be of interest. What about Steiner's understanding of the zodiac? And I've done a little studying into that, and of course he has his paintings that he's done, of the zodiac, and there's a lot in there. So anything you could address with that would be interesting.
I want to finish though just before, and I'll see if I have anything on that.
Apologies. Go ahead.
This meditation, we're kind of always making a picture of it as though it's kind of mystical. And the reality for Steiner was this, and I missed this, is that during these meditations, during this tempering of the soul, what actually begins to happen is organs of perception that we have in our etheric body and in our astral body wake up. The lotus flowers of the astral body, right? They wake up, and all the data, to go back to data, ironically, right? All the data of those worlds floods into your consciousness, the consciousness you now have because you've grown it to that degree. And you then can use your thinking powers to relate, understand, and bring all this stuff into a systematized understanding of the world, which we could not do, arguably, before science, maybe unless we were very unique initiates in the past, right?
And he stresses, Dale, if I'm wrong here, but he stresses the role of ego that plays into this, right? And how important that is.
Of course, and it's the ego that is the moral agency. That's what's going to know what is Christ-like, what is going to be Ahrimanic-like, what is going to be Luciferic-like, right? My ego doesn't know that very well. And that's the interesting part of trying to live in the Christ, is just for cognition purposes, just for the purposes of having a grounded knowing, is to try to understand the ego you have as being this reflection that's growing in the presence of the true ego, the high ego of the Christ being in us, right? Which is there for us in that thing. So I just wanted to throw that out. Those organs of perception to me are so valuable.
It's really,
your earlier question to me, as far as the old moon phase, we're talking about the water element conveying information from the astral, but then when that becomes physical, you need a physical counterpart in order to digest and discern that information. And those are, in fact, the organs of metabolism, the digestive organs, the liver, and so forth, that works with the arterial blood and then that meets at the choroid plexus in the spine with the cerebral spinal fluid, and then that physical data then becomes either resonance or dissonance because it's not intellectual information at the level that the astral needs. It needs to discern between those two elements, whether it's dissonant or harmonious. And then that, in fact, goes to the astral level and feeds back to the metabolism full circle. So that old moon phase was, in fact, the precursor to the development of our digestive system, and which Steiner would call the metabolic pole versus the neural pole. And then that can be correlated with the old Hermetic understanding of, the salt, the sulfur, and the mercury, and how the animation of the limbs and anthroposophical medicine is our actual will forces at play. But Mike, go ahead. So anyway, I just wanted to come back to that because I didn't really fully develop that answer.
There's so much there, right there. Wow. I was just gonna say, yeah, we're not talking about woo-woo out-of-body stuff with Steiner because we're talking about really the concentration of the egoic mind and our ability to then reach into these places of insights that we can and to bring them into this world in a way that's not escapist, right? That's not lost in the emotions and feelings. It's a really concentrated sensibility there of thinking, of the thinking mind, and then that it leads to, I would assume, creation, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's all in that, and in that ego he's talking about, of course, you have the life of feeling 10 times more powerful than the one you and I have.
Yep.
We have the life of will 10 times more powerful than the one you and I have, right? Living in the thinking, right?
Yep.
Because that thinking is controlled. So people think, oh, thinking, Steiner's this kind of thinker. And I'm like, oh, no. That thinking we're talking about is very holistic. The whole human being is living in this, and it's not in us. I'm using my brain and I'm performing brain dead thinking, right? I'm not experiencing thinking. I'm experiencing the corpses of thinking that reflect through my brain and that I can grasp until I can raise that to a deeper, richer experience, right? And that's the one everybody thinks you're talking about. And we're not. We're not talking about that at all.
Well, have you ever heard of a guy named Percival, W. Percival, Thinking
I've
and
seen
Destiny?
the books by him, but I've never read them.
I think, and I don't know if he ever had he's at the same time as Steiner, and there's this everything is in alignment between those two. It's wild, and a lot of Walter Russell connections too. If you've heard of Walter Russell,
a little bit of that name, yeah.
Yeah, there was a really magical time, the early 20th century. It's just like all these great minds came out of the woodwork that all had this synchronicity at play, and it's really fascinating. But Dale, this has been such a great chat. Anything to sort of sum it up or to finish on for our audience that you've gleaned from this discussion?
Yeah, I'm just wishing everybody well, and keep our hearts open even in this darkness. Just look at the hope, look at the love. You don't really, there isn't really anything else but love. I mean, we say this and we practice it so poorly, but I do, and I thank you guys for letting me be with you here, and reminding myself of that anyway, right? Because I can say it a ton of times and forget it in an instant. We're just muddling through. But Steiner's there. And I'm glad you mentioned he's that exemplar. If we want to try and see the direction humanity's to go, I can't imagine a better exemplary person to aspire to understand and deepen our understanding of. So, and I'm just grateful to everybody who appreciates the work I'm doing. Almost crying thinking about it, but I've had some very moving letters from people. I got to tell you, stunning stuff. People dying and, wanting to listen to Steiner as they're passing away. I mean, my God. I mean, it staggers me, honestly. So I thank you all for, giving my last chapters so much meaning. Go ahead, Var.
No, that's where, in the beginning, I just threw out divine providence. I think you played this role because you have brought Steiner to more listeners probably than any other source. So that's an amazing service, and thank you for that.
Yeah, amazing. I agree. Thank you so much. Well, I didn't know it was going to be such a short time. I'm just warming up, but
Well, one
We
thing
can go on for a
sorry, and
few more hours if you like.
one thing I did cut off though, and I didn't mean to, was Bear's question around the zodiac. Did you have any?
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, again, cosmologically, it's bizarre to say, right? One thing I do remember is Steiner, in the astrological sense, talked about in the past where, you have this picture of as we're going through the spheres after death. You guys have much
Yes.
information on that?
Mhm.
And you get out with the Earth as the center. You have the moon first, and then you have what's called Mercury, even though planetarily that's called Venus. It's actually the Mercury sphere, right? And then the Mercury sphere of the Mercury is the Venus sphere, then the sun. That in the old days, the higher beings were before Christ, the higher beings were so involved in our preparation for a new incarnation that they would really were involved in kind of in each phase of that uh, grafting destiny-driven impulses into those spheres that then when we were born again, we would experience. And so astrology was very real then, right? Because you really, when there was an alignment, bam, you were really experiencing that in your etheric and astral and whatever, right? But after Christ, he says, and maybe this is again growing, it hasn't come to its full realization. He says that we go through the spheres and in our cooperation with the hierarchies, we come to the needed impulses for our next life. And when we get to Saturn and we begin the return, we ourselves inscribe these things ourselves now through the power of Christ. And now they become different. Now we don't get astrology, we get astrosophy, as Steiner called it, right? Willie Suker, and I don't know if you know about this, right? So there's a whole new development of astrology. It's gone to the next level, shall we say? And I'm not an expert on it. Boy, the experts on it, if you've ever met one, they are intense people, right? But I get such a fascinating picture there of now when I have any kind of experiences of astrological influence, let's call it, they're from my own deeds of writing this in the heavens. Isn't that a gorgeous picture? I just find that astonishing. But
An interface there, a back
yeah,
and forth interface.
yeah,
It's
And
not
it
this fatalism that you get with traditional astrology.
nice. There you go. That's it right there. That's it right there.
well, in the Saint Germain teachings, which I believe are just what Rudolph Steiner helped prepare the way for, is they talk about the astrological teachings and how we would, in this particular era, be reaching what Steiner talked about as the seventh octave, where we go past the I. And in that seventh octave, we are now the designers of our own realm and capable of transmutation and so forth. There's a great book. I don't know if you've seen this one. It takes all of Steiner's original artwork relative to the zodiac, and he takes you through it all. And that's available in the Steiner buildings to this day, I believe, all his original artwork on the zodiac. And he talks about two zodiacs, going in different directions. And
Wow.
the one that's going retrograde is actually the overall design for our realm that takes humanity through the different eras of evolutionary awareness development, we'll say, and where the typical zodiac that people have focused on it goes in the opposite direction. It is actually astrophysiology and follows the development of our human form. So it's a great little book. And
Who's that by? Is that by
what's
Adrian Anderson?
yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay.
It is.
Yeah, I've read a bit of that person from Australia, I think, right? I think that's what,
Not sure offhand.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have a few of their,
Interesting how much Steiner is in Australia. It's a big effect there. There's a
yeah,
lot of
Yeah.
farms there and wineries that are, all following his techniques. It's really interesting. Well, that's awesome, Bear. I want to definitely check out that book.
yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah, it's a good one.
It's
Well,
astonishing.
thank you so much again. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's just such an astonishing breadth of material Steiner gave that in and of itself, in each breadth, a moment is shockingly deep at the same time. And you're like, wow, you
It's
know,
like,
and
how is
people
he
take it
putting out this much output too? I
25
mean,
years.
like it's like he was always writing or something. He
Yeah.
was always working.
Yeah. The lectures. Yeah. I mean, he was always lecturing. Yeah.
Was he doing work in the astral like while he was sleeping? Was he working on lectures? Like,
There's a beautiful set of anecdotes by people who are his pupils called "A Man Before a Man Before All Others." Shoot, I've got it here. And there's a one in there about a woman who is a very profound meditator and who was a pupil of Steiner's. And she had asked him once, who he was, and he doesn't say. And she was in meditation, she says, and there was this star that she had an experience of that started to get closer and closer to her, and was this shining light by her, very comforting to her. And she asked this light uh, if it was Rudolf Steiner, and he said, even so, she said in German, ebenso. And she says, and as he said that, she then looked through the light and saw Steiner in meditation. So Steiner, I think did, and it's a great question. I think he did a lot of work in the astral world, in what we would call sleep. You know what I mean? Whatever that is, right?
yeah.
Uh, and so there's a whole side of him. There's no way we don't know. In fact, that's a good one, right? There's a whole half of him,
Yeah.
or maybe 90% of him that's utterly invisible to us. Yeah. There's that great story about that when he was in Stuttgart and or in Berlin, and they had a place where the kids would, they just had a lot of bustling activity. But Steiner had this one room that was for him, and he would meet people in there. And the woman that would help clean up or whatever, or bring in stuff, would come in, and once in a while she'd finally said to Steiner, every once in a while, sir, when I go into that room to clean up or whatever, there's a smell of roses in there, she says.
Ah,
But there aren't any roses in the room. He goes, I had been with the
Yes.
masters.
Yeah. Heard
I
that
had been
one.
with the masters, right? You're like, well, wait, that isn't in any book I've ever read.
Yeah.
Give me a lecture cycle on that one, Steiner.
Right.
You
in
know,
the original Saint Germain volumes, they talk about how the masters give off that aroma and why the rose is so special, as far as
what did they say
an
about it?
epitome.
I know
Well,
you
just
guys
that,
got to leave, but
The
okay.
Rosencrantz.
no, just that ascended masters gave off that aroma, very, very distinctly, and that the rose was kind of like the empress of the flower kingdom. And and you could go into what aromas actually represent in a
Yeah,
certain
yeah.
part of our brain. It's really the most refined part of our sensory system.
Well, it's a
Mhm.
wonderful story that where somebody asked Steiner about Rose. He said, well, he says the Rose family carries all the childhood memories of humanity.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And for
A
some reason,
rose is a
you
rose by
smell the
no other
rose and you
name.
go, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he's right there too. Because now I got a concept to hook to something so magical as the
Yeah.
inexpressible wonder of the smell of roses.
Wow. One last question and we'll go. Was Steiner there's a conspiracy theory that Steiner was actually taken out. He was poisoned. Any foundation in that?
That's still a controversy. Now,
Yeah.
apparently, Marie Steiner, his wife, said he was. And
Hmm.
in other places, they think stomach cancer, whatever else, And so again, it's just like you say, it's not so much conspiracy theory as there's evidence
Mhm.
of something other than natural causes. But
Mhm.
Well, I say
I
conspiracy
don't have an
theory
opinion on it.
because it was a conspiracy to take him out.
Yeah. And he
Yeah.
was attacked, the last years of his life. He was
Yep.
they had to stand guard. And there are a couple of people even who wrote pridefully that they had to fight off people who were trying to get through them to attack
Ah,
Steiner.
interesting.
Yeah. So there,
Hmm.
and there's a story where I don't know if it was Stein, it was somebody wrote the anecdote, maybe Sam Weber. There's a wonderful little book by her where after a lecture, 3,000 people, this was very at the end before he could never lecture again in Germany, that he came into the room. He said, lock the door. He said, lock the door. And Steiner collapsed on the ground for a number of minutes. And when he got up, he said, I had to battle some demons right there.
Ah.
I've heard that.
Yeah. So, and she seems pretty reliable as a witness, as it were, you know. And again, that invisible world that was going on all the time, we have no clue about it because he just didn't, you know, he wasn't a sensationalist in that sense at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Dale, thank you so much. I'd love to have you back. You know, I don't know, 6 months, a year from now, there's so much to talk about for Steiner. We didn't really touch on, you know, Archangel Michael and all that stuff at the late 19th century. I wanted to touch on and where we are now with, you know, the hierarchy and the help that we're getting and all that. And then there's endless stuff to cover with the breadth of Steiner. So this was a great first chat. I look forward to other ones, and thank you again for all your work. I'll make sure to have all your links in the show notes below. I've just got the Steiner Press YouTube channel, but you have your own YouTube channel and you have your own website, correct?
Well, and that's true. When I did the Podbean thing, they asked me, "Hey, do you want to send these to Spotify and to YouTube?" I went, "Oh, okay." And so they automatically go there when I put them up on Podbean. So there's also a Spotify channel as well. But I don't pay any attention to that stuff at all. So I just concentrate on rudolfsteineraudio.com. That's what I.
And such a wonderful way for new students of Steiner to get introduced to the work. You know, you can download them, do them when you're in the car driving anywhere. So wonderful service. Thank you again. Thanks for being with us.
Guys.
And I look forward to talking to you again.
Excellent. I'd love it. I'd love it. Blessings.
Okay, my friend.
Thank you. Hey, and thanks everybody out in the chat. Appreciate, love you. Remember to get outside, get your feet in the dirt, go plant something, go show Mother Nature some love. She'll show it right back to you. We love you guys. And we'll see you for a special 5 p.m. Thursday next week show with Bart Sibrel. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. It's going to be a good one. Okay, guys.
And it's, yeah, go ahead. That's good. We'll sign off.
Yeah.
I had another anecdote about that one, but save it for next time.
We'll save it for the show next week. That's going to be a great one. Another guy who was recently on Joe Rogan's podcast. I think we and Rogan are syncing up here, Bear. What's going on?
But Donald said we're going to Mars.
Oh, yeah. Okay. We have a lot to talk about next week.